Number one, all of the existing manuscript evidence, surviving ancient manuscripts, copies of the New Testament, are all in Greek, whether complete copies or fragmentary. Number two, the ancient translations. Because Christianity was a mission-oriented religion, it wasn't too long before the need came up to take the New Testament documents and translate them into other languages, the earliest ones being Syriac, Coptic, and Latin. In each case, these translations were made from Greek originals. Number three, the witness of early church fathers. Early church fathers, such as the man who wrote First Clement, the letters of Ignatius, Polycarp of Smyrna, were all written in Greek, and where they allude to or quote the New Testament, they quote it in Greek from Greek sources. And I picked those three names because they're all from about the 95 AD to maybe 115 AD time frame, so they're relatively early. Now, the New Testament gives no indication of being a translation. By that I mean if you take a document of length and translate it from one language to English to German or whatever, there will be signs that what you are reading now in English is a translation. There are just too many differences between languages. You can't smoothly transition in every word and phrase over to a target language. And the New Testament just does not give really no indication, solid indications of being a translation. Number five, the New Testament's use of the Greek Septuagint. If you're not familiar with it, the Septuagint was the old Greek translation of the Old Testament from Hebrew into Greek. And at least 50% of the Old Testament quotations and verbal allusions in the New Testament are based on the Greek Septuagint, not the Hebrew Old Testament. Although there are some authors, Matthew and Paul, who used both the Hebrew in some cases and the Septuagint in other cases. Now, if the New Testament was originally written in Hebrew, there's no way to explain this usage. Number six, the New Testament itself in a number of places translates Aramaic and or Hebrew words and terms into Greek for a Greek-speaking audience. Number seven, the authors of the New Testament utilized aspects of the Greek language as they put the documents together. Now, how they did so varied depending on their skill level of Greek, but this would include things like alliterations, word plays, using synonyms, double and even triple negatives in the Greek, compound words, and so on. Greek, for example, lends itself to the formation of compound words. That's when you take two or more individual words and put them together to produce a single resulting word. And Greek lends itself to that, and Hebrew, in fact, does not. About the only place where you find compound words in biblical Hebrew is proper names, like Yeshua. Number eight, the New Testament books also reflect the individual skill levels with Greek of the various authors, as well as their personality traits. And unfortunately, this is often lost in translation, even from Greek into English. The book of James, for example, is written in very good Greek. 2 Peter is, not so good. But if you read the King James, 2 Peter and James, they're going to both appear to be fairly comparable in quality. This is difficult to explain if the New Testament was written in Hebrew and then translated later into Greek. And the natural tendency is going to be to smooth out things like bad grammar, to smooth out those certain personality traits. Paul at times could be quite irritable, and that just doesn't sound right. This is supposed to be an apostle of Jesus Christ. We don't want to think of him as having anger issues or anything like that. So the tendency would be to smooth out those rough edges. Well, we don't have that in the Greek New Testament. And again, unfortunately, a lot of these things are lost in translation into English. Christianity was a mission-oriented religion given the task of taking the gospel to every nation. If you are going to do that task, when it comes time to pick your medium of communication for at least your written documents, the most practical choice at that time would be Greek. One of the most impractical choices would be Hebrew. It makes no sense. Now, what is the evidence for a Hebrew original New Testament? Well, existing ancient Hebrew manuscripts. There are none. There are none, period. Now, as far as ancient translations of the New Testament made from a Hebrew original into Coptic, Latin, Syriac, and so on, there are none. The only real evidence is an enigmatic quotation from an early church father from Hierapolis named Papias. We know very little about him. He was a bishop in Hierapolis, which is now present-day Turkey. He was a bishop. He had been a disciple of Polycarp, and he reportedly wrote a 5-volume commentary on the sayings of Jesus. Now, none of his writings have survived, nor have copies of his writings survived. We only have a few fragmentary quotations that were written down long after the fact by some later church fathers, including a short enigmatic statement about Matthew having been written in a Hebrew dialect. we have that quotation preserved by Eusebius, the church historian, writing about 200 years after Papias died. There's no way to corroborate or substantiate that quotation. How do we know that Eusebius has it written down accurately? And for that matter, how do we know that Papias was even correct in the first place? He actually himself wrote in Greek. The word that he used when he described Matthew being in a Hebrew dialect is a word that can refer to either Aramaic or Hebrew, and there's no way to know for certain which one he meant. So that's your evidence for a Hebrew original. A quotation that cannot be independently verified, that has several ambiguities in it. Now, does it matter? And why does it matter? Included in these claims that the New Testament was penned in Hebrew are insinuations and sometimes outright charges that the Greek New Testament contains corruption, pagan ideas introduced by the later, largely Gentile and Greek-speaking church. It thus becomes necessary to correct those corruptions utilizing the original Hebrew New Testament. How do we do that? Because we don't have an original Hebrew New Testament. At best, what these proponents of this position can do is speculate or guess at what they think or hope the Hebrew original said. And some of these guys now are beginning to translate the Greek back into Hebrew. That's their way to recover the original Hebrew. And it becomes a real problem because Greek and Hebrew are vastly different languages. They are significantly different. And if you're going to go from Greek to Hebrew, you're going to have some real problems. And if you get 10 guys doing that exercise on one verse, you're going to come up with 10 different translations. There is a satanic agenda in all this, and that is to undermine Christian confidence in the Greek New Testament. If we decide that we cannot trust the Greek New Testament, that it is not correct, that it is not the original, where do we go from there? If we do not have reliable and accurate copies of what Jesus and the apostles actually taught, then we do not have a subjective and steadfast source for right Christian conduct in belief, and we might as well pack our bags and go home.